Nobody notices operational intelligence until the trucks stop moving. At 2:07 in the morning, dispatch centers across 20 states began receiving the same call. Drivers could not access updated routes. Fuel authorization codes were failing. Priority freight assignments had vanished from the system without warning. Inside the company headquarters in Dallas, the overnight operations dashboard started filling with red indicators faster than the software could refresh them. Chicago, Memphis, Phoenix, Atlanta, Denver. One by one, regional logistics hubs lost synchronized routing data. Then refrigerated trailers carrying pharmaceutical shipments stopped receiving compliance confirmations. That was when people inside the executive floor finally understood this was not a software glitch. This was systemic. Within 36 minutes, 950 trucks were sitting idle across interstate corridors, truck stops, fuel stations, and warehouse access lanes. Drivers began calling dispatch simultaneously. Some were carrying temperature-sensitive cargo. Some had federally regulated medical inventory. Others were already 12 hours into long-haul routes with no updated delivery authorization. And somewhere inside the routing infrastructure, a single warning message kept repeating across every operations screen in the building. Legacy authorization layer unavailable. Most executives in the emergency conference room did not understand what the sentence meant. The new chief executive officer certainly did not. He stood near the glass wall overlooking downtown Dallas with his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, trying to project calm, while three separate regional vice presidents argued over each other near the main conference table. One blamed the migration consultants. Another blamed the cloud infrastructure vendor. Someone else suggested a cyber attack. But the older dispatch supervisors were not speaking. They were staring silently at the same warning message. Legacy authorization layer unavailable. At 2:41 in the morning, the company received its first lender escalation call. At 3:12, a national retail chain threatened emergency penalties for delayed inventory delivery. At 3:34, fuel contractors suspended automatic fleet authorizations pending routing verification. That was when the chairman of the board finally asked the question nobody in the room wanted to answer. Who built this system in the first place? The room went quiet. Not because nobody knew, because everybody suddenly knew exactly who he meant. Andrew Mercer, 52 years old, 15 years inside the company, former National Logistics Operations Director, terminated 11 days earlier. Official reason: Leadership Modernization Initiative. The new chief executive officer had announced the restructuring himself during a company-wide town hall. He called it a transition towards scalable automation and predictive logistics intelligence. Most people in the room applauded politely. Andrew did not react. He simply sat there in the third row with a legal pad resting on one knee while younger systems engineers explained how artificial intelligence routing models would eliminate operational inefficiencies caused by what leadership called legacy management culture. Nobody noticed the dispatch supervisors exchanging nervous glances during the presentation. Nobody noticed the warehouse directors stop taking notes. And nobody noticed that several long-haul operations managers quietly started calling each other later that night. Because deep inside the company, there were systems nobody talked about during presentations. Emergency freight prioritization, weather rerouting authority, manual compliance overrides, lender-linked risk authentication. The things that only mattered when everything else failed. The new executives believed logistics was mostly mathematics. Andrew knew it was accumulated human judgment under pressure. At 4:18 in the morning, another regional routing hub went dark. A refrigerated warehouse outside Kansas City reported 83 trailers waiting for destination authorization. Drivers began sleeping inside parked trucks because dispatch could not legally clear them onto updated interstate routes. The company's stock dropped 7% before the market even opened. And somewhere in the middle of the growing panic, one exhausted operations analyst quietly pulled up an archived maintenance file that had not been opened in almost 4 years. Attached to the bottom was a handwritten authorization note. Single continuity bridge tied to biometric verification cycle. Do not remove without full operational migration. Signed, Andrew Mercer. If you have ever worked inside a large company, you already know what happened next. Because the most dangerous systems are never the ones executives understand. They are the ones quietly held together by the person they thought they could replace. And this collapse had only just begun. 11 days earlier, The company still believed the transition was under control. The presentation slide said the future of logistics would be automated, predictive, and scalable. Every executive repeated the same language. Operational modernization, artificial intelligence optimization, dependency reduction. Andrew Mercer sat through all of it without interrupting once. He had spent 15 years inside the company, long enough to know that executives often confused visibility with understanding. The people running the presentations understood dashboards. Andrew understood weather delays in Nebraska during freezing rain. He understood how exhausted drivers made different decisions after their 9th hour on Interstate 70. He understood which warehouse managers panicked early and which ones stayed calm during routing disruptions. He understood how retail chains reacted when inventory visibility disappeared for more than 4 hours. None of those things appeared inside executive metrics. At 7:30 every morning, Andrew used to walk through the National Operations Center before most senior leadership arrived. No speeches, no dramatic management style, just quiet observation. Coffee in one hand, legal pad in the other. He checked overnight reroutes personally. He reviewed fuel allocation exceptions. He watched dispatch teams instead of dashboards. Most younger analysts assumed he was old-fashioned because he still printed emergency routing summaries on paper during severe weather weeks. They did not understand why. Andrew trusted systems, but he never trusted systems completely. That difference mattered more than anybody realized. The new chief executive officer, Daniel Cross, arrived from a technology consulting background 18 months earlier after leading 2 aggressive corporate restructurings in the transportation sector. 41 years old, sharp speaker, perfect investor call personality. The board loved him immediately. He spoke in scalable language, predictive infrastructure, optimization efficiency, human redundancy reduction. Everything sounded modern. Everything sounded expensive. And for a while, Wall Street rewarded it. The company's stock climbed almost 19% during Daniel Cross's first year. Consultants flooded the building. Regional authority structures were consolidated. Legacy operational layers were flagged for elimination. Younger systems engineers were promoted rapidly. Most of them genuinely believed they were improving the company. That was the dangerous part. Nobody thought they were creating instability. They thought they were removing inefficiency. 3 days before Andrew's termination, a consulting group delivered a 78-page report to the executive committee. One sentence appeared 3 different times inside the document. The company remains overly dependent on personality-driven operational continuity. Daniel Cross highlighted the sentence personally during the executive review meeting. Andrew remained silent. Not defensive, not emotional, just tired, because he already knew what was coming next. The official restructuring meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon. Cold room, glass walls, 12 executives, 2 attorneys, 1 human resources representative. The termination itself lasted less than 9 minutes. Daniel Cross tried to sound respectful. He explained the company was moving towards centralized automated infrastructure and no longer needed regional continuity leadership roles structured around manual operational authority. Andrew nodded once. No argument. No anger. He simply asked whether the emergency continuity migration had been fully validated. One of the younger systems directors answered immediately. Yes, every dependency has already been mapped into the new architecture. Andrew studied him for a moment, then closed his folder. That was the entire conversation. No dramatic exit. No threats. No speeches. Just a man with 15 years of operational memory quietly leaving a building full of people who believed software documentation and operational understanding were the same thing. But after he left, strange things started happening almost immediately. Dispatch supervisors began creating private backup spreadsheets. Regional warehouse managers started saving printed freight manifests again. A senior routing coordinator in Memphis delayed his retirement paperwork without explaining why. Nobody openly challenged leadership. But the older operations people had seen this pattern before. The problem was never the visible system. The problem was always the hidden dependency nobody fully understood until pressure arrived. And pressure always arrived eventually. Late Friday evening, 2 days after Andrew left, a junior systems engineer submitted an internal infrastructure ticket requesting permanent removal of legacy biometric authorization cycling. The request was approved in 14 minutes. Nobody escalated it. Nobody reviewed the old continuity notes attached to the original architecture. Nobody noticed that several emergency routing bridges still authenticated through that same layer during overnight synchronization, because the executives believed they had already replaced the man who understood those systems. What they actually replaced was the last person who knew how all the invisible pieces failed together. The first signs of instability were almost invisible. That was what made them dangerous. 3 days after Andrew Mercer left the company, overnight routing latency increased by 4.3% across the Midwest distribution network. To executives, the number looked insignificant. To dispatch coordinators, it felt wrong immediately. Drivers started reporting delayed route confirmations after crossing state lines. Warehouse departure windows drifted 15 to 20 minutes behind schedule. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet. But experienced logistics people understood something younger analysts did not. Large infrastructure failures rarely begin with collapse. They begin with hesitation. At the Dallas headquarters, the restructuring teams continued moving forward aggressively. Conference rooms stayed full from morning until evening. Consultants covered entire glass walls with migration flowcharts and optimization models. The language inside those meetings barely resembled the language used on warehouse floors. Leadership talked about scalability. Dispatch supervisors talked about weather exposure. Executives discussed predictive freight balancing. Regional managers worried about refrigerated trailers sitting too long outside loading bays. The two groups were technically discussing the same system, but they were living in completely different realities. Daniel Cross believed the transition was progressing exactly as planned. He spent most of that week preparing for an investor call scheduled the following Monday. The presentation focused heavily on automation efficiency gains, reduced labor dependency, centralized operational intelligence, artificial intelligence-assisted freight optimization. The board loved the numbers. The company's stock continued climbing. Inside the operations center, however, people were quietly changing their routines. A veteran dispatcher in St. Louis began manually verifying overnight routes before shift changes. A warehouse supervisor in Nashville printed emergency delivery manifests without authorization. 2 regional fuel coordinators stopped trusting automated priority assignments and started making verbal confirmations by phone. Nobody reported these workarounds officially, because nobody wanted to sound resistant to modernization. That word had become dangerous inside the company. Modernization. It was repeated constantly now. Anyone who questioned the restructuring risked being labeled part of the old system. And nobody wanted to become the next person removed. Late Tuesday evening, a routing analyst noticed that several emergency weather override paths were no longer synchronizing correctly between the central logistics engine and regional dispatch hubs. The issue ticket was classified as low priority. The automated system still produced valid routes, technically, but the sequencing logic had started behaving differently under high-load freight conditions. Most people would never notice the distinction. Andrew Mercer would have noticed it immediately, because Andrew never evaluated logistics systems during stable conditions. He evaluated them during failure conditions. That was the difference. Wednesday morning brought another anomaly. A pharmaceutical shipment outside Columbus lost temperature-sensitive freight priority during a routine reroute sequence after interstate congestion forced a dispatch revision. The issue was corrected manually before the cargo window expired. Still, the regional operations manager filed an internal concern report. No executive responded. By Thursday afternoon, several dispatch supervisors privately started referring to the situation as soft drift. Not collapse. Drift. The system still worked. But confidence inside the operations teams was eroding. And confidence was everything in logistics. Because once drivers stopped trusting routing stability, human behavior changed. People double-checked instructions. They delayed decisions. They waited for verbal confirmation. That hesitation spread through networks faster than software errors ever could. At 1:30 Eastern Time that Thursday afternoon, the automated infrastructure team finalized the permanent removal of the old biometric continuity cycle attached to the legacy authorization layer. The engineers celebrated quietly afterward. Another outdated dependency eliminated. Another modernization milestone completed. Nobody realized that several emergency freight continuity bridges still authenticated through fragments of that same architecture during overnight synchronization balancing. The old system had never been elegant. That was why executives underestimated it. Andrew had built it years earlier after a catastrophic winter routing failure nearly destroyed the company during a national fuel shortage. He did not design it for efficiency. He designed it for survival. The difference between those two philosophies would become painfully clear in less than 12 hours. At 11:47 that night, the first routing synchronization chain failed silently. No alarms triggered immediately. No dramatic shutdown occurred. A single regional freight balancing node simply stopped validating emergency continuity pathways during overnight route refresh cycles. Then another one followed. Then another. And somewhere deep inside the routing infrastructure, systems that had depended on invisible operational judgment for over a decade suddenly began trying to function alone. The first truck stopped moving outside Amarillo, Texas at 12:18 in the morning. The driver had been waiting for an updated fuel authorization code that never arrived. At first, dispatch assumed it was a routine delay. Then 7 more trucks reported the same issue within the next 11 minutes. Then 23. Then 41. Inside the Dallas Operations Center, analysts started reopening closed routing tickets because destination updates were disappearing after synchronization refresh cycles. Not corrupted, not deleted, simply gone. At 12:52, a regional warehouse in Indianapolis reported that outbound freight manifests no longer matched central routing assignments. A supervisor manually compared shipment codes against archived dispatch records and discovered entire delivery chains had been reassigned to invalid destinations. Nobody understood how. The system still appeared operational. That was the terrifying part. The dashboards were alive, but the infrastructure underneath them was beginning to separate. At 1:07 in the morning, a senior overnight dispatcher named Carla Ruiz finally said what everyone else in the room had been avoiding. "This feels like continuity failure." Nobody answered her immediately, because continuity failure was one of those phrases older logistics people rarely used unless the situation was already dangerous. You only reached continuity failure when systems stopped trusting each other. At 1:30 Eastern Time, the automated overnight balancing cycle attempted to authenticate emergency freight authority through the removed legacy authorization bridge, and failed. The effect was not dramatic. No alarms exploded. No servers crashed. The routing engine simply stopped validating high-priority synchronization pathways between regional dispatch systems. Within minutes, automated freight sequencing began generating contradictions faster than human operators could manually correct them. Fuel authorization chains froze first. Then refrigerated routing priorities disappeared. Then overnight interstate handoff coordination stopped refreshing altogether. Drivers crossing state lines started losing destination confirmation signals mid-route. That was when dispatch centers across 20 states began calling Dallas simultaneously. The operations floor changed completely after that. Nobody talked about modernization anymore. Nobody talked about artificial intelligence. People only spoke in fragments now. How many trucks in Missouri? Who still has manual access? Which warehouses still trust local manifests? Can anybody verify fuel release authority? At 2:03 in the morning, Daniel Cross finally arrived at headquarters, still wearing the same suit from the investor dinner he had attended earlier that evening. He entered the operations floor expecting urgency. What he encountered instead was fear. Not loud fear. The quiet kind. The kind experienced professionals develop after recognizing something structurally wrong. Several dispatch supervisors barely acknowledged him. They were too busy making direct phone calls to drivers because automated routing confirmations could no longer be trusted. A young systems engineer attempted to reassure the room. "The central infrastructure is still online." Carla Ruiz looked at him for 2 seconds before replying. "That is the problem." The room fell silent again. At 2:41, lenders initiated emergency exposure review procedures tied to delayed freight visibility thresholds. At 2:58, 2 national retailers suspended overnight inventory acceptance pending routing verification. At 3:12, a refrigerated pharmaceutical carrier reported that compliance tracking windows had failed across multiple routes. That call changed everything, because regulatory exposure meant potential federal review. Now the problem was no longer operational. It was financial, legal, institutional. Daniel Cross ordered the consultants into the emergency conference room immediately. 3 separate infrastructure teams began searching for override access pathways. Nothing worked. The system kept rejecting emergency continuity escalation requests, not because the software was malfunctioning, because the removed authorization bridge had once quietly connected dozens of fragmented operational layers nobody fully documented. One systems architect finally pulled up archived continuity diagrams from 7 years earlier. Most of the room stared at the screen without understanding what they were looking at, but the older dispatch supervisors understood instantly. Every major emergency routing sequence inside the company had once passed through Andrew Mercer. Not directly, indirectly, quietly, over years. Hundreds of operational decisions layered on top of each other. Weather protocols, fuel contingencies, retail escalation logic, manual override pathways, emergency freight balancing. Human judgment embedded slowly into infrastructure until nobody could separate the system from the person who stabilized it. At 3:34 in the morning, the chairman of the board entered the conference room remotely from New York. Nobody bothered summarizing the situation anymore. The dashboards already showed enough. 950 trucks without synchronized routing. Frozen freight chains. Escalating lender pressure. Regulatory exposure risk. The chairman listened for almost 4 minutes without interrupting. Then he asked a question that changed the room completely. Who approved removing the continuity bridge? Nobody answered immediately, not because they did not know, because they finally understood the real problem. The company had spent 18 months trying to eliminate dependency on one man, without realizing he had spent 15 years quietly preventing dependency failures they no longer even remembered existed. By sunrise, the company had stopped pretending the situation was temporary. The language inside headquarters changed overnight. Nobody used the word optimization anymore. Now the conversations revolved around containment. Containment of routing instability. Containment of lender exposure. Containment of client panic. At 6:20 in the morning, the overnight operations report landed in the executive inboxes. 950 trucks affected. 211 refrigerated freight delays. 17 warehouse synchronization failures. For major retail escalation notices. And one sentence highlighted in red near the bottom of the report. Emergency continuity architecture remains unstable pending legacy authorization restoration. Daniel Cross read the report twice before speaking. Then he asked the systems teams the same question he had already asked 4 times during the night. Why was this dependency never documented? Nobody answered directly. Because the answer was humiliating. It had been documented, repeatedly, but buried inside years of continuity notes, emergency routing exceptions, and operational architecture reviews that executives stopped reading once the company became profitable again. The infrastructure worked so consistently for so many years that leadership eventually assumed it no longer required human oversight. That assumption was now spreading across 20 states like a fracture line. At 8:03, the stock opened down 13%. By 9/11, transportation analysts on financial networks began questioning whether the company had lost operational visibility over portions of its logistics chain. At 9:40, a national grocery retailer suspended incoming temperature-sensitive freight acceptance until route verification stability could be confirmed independently. Inside the operations center, nobody even looked surprised anymore. Dispatch supervisors had stopped trusting the automated system completely. They were routing trucks manually wherever possible. Phone calls replaced dashboards. Paper manifests replaced synchronization reports. One warehouse director in Oklahoma City reportedly slept inside his office because outbound freight sequencing changed 4 times within 6 hours. The company still technically had functioning software. What it no longer had was confidence. And logistics without confidence becomes paralysis very quickly. Around noon, a consulting team attempted to rebuild the removed continuity bridge manually. The effort failed almost immediately, not because the software was too complicated, because the system was no longer just software. Over 15 years, Andrew Mercer had layered operational judgment into hundreds of small routing behaviors nobody fully noticed while the network remained stable. Weather exceptions. Fuel prioritization during regional shortages. Retail escalation sequencing. Emergency interstate rerouting during seasonal disruptions. Human override patterns built slowly over years of real-world failures. The younger engineers understood architecture. Andrew had understood consequences. That difference was becoming expensive. At 1:17 in the afternoon, The company received formal notice that portions of its $55 million revolving credit facility were being temporarily suspended pending operational risk reassessment. The lender language remained polite, but everyone inside the executive floor understood the meaning immediately. The banks no longer trusted the company to manage freight visibility reliably. That was catastrophic. Without stable lender confidence, fuel contracts, warehouse financing, and retail guarantees all became vulnerable. Daniel Cross stopped speaking publicly after that. He moved between conference rooms with two attorneys and the infrastructure consultants while board members joined emergency calls from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Some executives still believed the company could solve the problem internally. Others had already realized the truth. The operational continuity layer was never fully automated because Andrew Mercer never believed it should be. Late that afternoon, Carla Ruiz received a direct call from a regional logistics competitor. Not for recruitment, for information. Industry rumors were already spreading. Competitors had started hearing about routing instability inside the company. One rival freight network reportedly began contacting retail clients directly, offering emergency contingency capacity if delays continued through the weekend. The market was reacting faster than leadership could stabilize the system. At 4:42, the chairman requested a closed executive session without Daniel Cross present. That single decision traveled through headquarters faster than any routing failure alert. People stopped pretending this was merely a technology issue. Now it was political, institutional, personal. Inside the closed session, one board member finally asked the question nobody wanted attached to official meeting minutes. Can Mercer stabilize this if he comes back? Silence filled the room again. Then Carla Ruiz answered quietly through the speakerphone from Dallas. Yes, but not quickly. That was the moment the board finally understood the scale of the mistake. They had not removed a manager. They had removed the last operational bridge between the company and chaos. They no longer remembered how to control themselves. By the beginning of the second week, the company was no longer fighting a systems outage. It was fighting erosion, not dramatic collapse. Something slower, more dangerous. Confidence was disappearing everywhere at once. Drivers started requesting manual confirmation before crossing state transfer zones. Warehouse managers delayed outbound releases because routing assignments kept changing after synchronization refreshes. Retail chains demanded hourly freight visibility updates the company could no longer guarantee consistently. And every workaround created more instability somewhere else. Inside the Dallas Operations Center, the atmosphere had changed completely. The younger engineers stopped speaking with certainty. The consultants stopped using presentation language. Nobody talked about optimization anymore. Now conversations revolved around exposure. Insurance exposure. Regulatory exposure. Financial exposure. At 8:14 Monday morning, a refrigerated pharmaceutical shipment outside Louisville missed its federally required temperature verification escalation window after routing synchronization delayed confirmation sequencing by 23 minutes. The cargo itself remained safe, but the compliance incident triggered automatic review procedures. That single event generated more executive panic than the previous 4 days combined. Because operational instability could sometimes be hidden, regulatory attention could not. At 9:02, the legal department requested direct oversight access to all emergency freight prioritization systems. At 9:40, lenders demanded independent operational verification before restoring suspended portions of the revolving credit facility. At 10:11, fuel contractors shortened payment windows for fleet authorization guarantees. Every layer of institutional trust was tightening simultaneously. And deep inside the company, people finally began saying Andrew Mercer's name openly again. Not emotionally, practically. The strange part was how ordinary the conversation sounded. Can Mercer validate the continuity chains remotely? Does Mercer still have archived weather routing access? Would Mercer even answer the phone? Nobody spoke about him like a former executive anymore. They spoke about him like missing infrastructure. Late that afternoon, Carla Ruiz walked through the operations floor carrying printed rerouting manifests because the digital synchronization system still could not reliably stabilize overnight freight balancing. One of the younger analysts looked exhausted. He stared at the growing stack of manual paperwork and asked quietly how the company ever handled national disruptions before automation. Carla did not even look up when she answered. Andrew. That was all she said. No speech. No explanation. But several older dispatch supervisors nearby stopped working for a moment after hearing it. Because they remembered. Winter storms. Fuel shortages. Interstate closures. Pandemic freight surges. They remembered Andrew sleeping inside the operations center for 31 straight hours during a Midwest ice event 6 years earlier, because rerouting delays threatened medical deliveries across 4 states. They remembered him manually reorganizing freight priority chains during hurricane season while executives attended investor conferences from hotel ballrooms. Most importantly, they remembered something the board had forgotten. The system had never been stable because the software was intelligent. It had been stable because Andrew Mercer constantly corrected the places where reality refused to behave like software predictions. That distinction was now becoming brutally visible. Tuesday morning brought another escalation. A major retail chain quietly transferred emergency freight capacity to a competitor network after repeated synchronization failures disrupted overnight inventory forecasting. The contract loss itself was manageable. What terrified leadership was what it represented. Market trust migration. Competitors had started positioning themselves as safer operational partners. That kind of reputation damage spread faster than technical failures ever could. At noon, Daniel Cross finally addressed the executive floor publicly for the first time since the crisis began. The room listened carefully, not because they trusted him, because they wanted to hear whether he still understood the scale of the situation. He spoke about stabilization progress, infrastructure recovery pathways, advanced systems recalibration. Nobody interrupted him, but nobody looked reassured either. Then one senior regional manager asked a simple question. Can the routing engine currently guarantee continuity under severe weather disruption? Daniel hesitated, only briefly, but everyone in the room noticed. Because hesitation inside logistics leadership was contagious. After the meeting ended, the chairman called another private board session from New York. This time, nobody argued about whether Andrew Mercer should be contacted. The only debate remaining was whether the company still had enough credibility left for him to say yes. Because by then, the truth had become impossible to avoid. The company did not lose control because artificial intelligence failed. It lost control because leadership removed the one person who understood where automation stopped and operational judgment began. The call to Andrew Mercer happened on a Thursday evening at 7:43 Central Time. Not from Daniel Cross. The board had already decided against that. The call came directly from the chairman in New York. Short. Private. No attorneys on the line. No consultants. Just 2 men who both understood the company was running out of time. Andrew answered after the third ring. His voice sounded calm. Not surprised. The chairman skipped formalities almost immediately. He explained the operational instability, the lender pressure, the contract exposure, the routing failures. Andrew listened without interrupting once. When the chairman finally stopped speaking, there was a long silence on the line. Then Andrew asked a single question. Who is currently approving emergency continuity authority? The chairman hesitated, because there was no good answer. 3 different executive teams had partial authority now. Consultants controlled infrastructure access. Legal controlled compliance escalation. Finance controlled lender coordination. Nobody controlled the entire system anymore. Andrew understood the problem immediately. Fragmented authority during operational instability was fatal in logistics, especially under time pressure. The chairman finally asked what nobody inside the company wanted to admit publicly. Can this still be stabilized? Andrew answered honestly, yes, but not quickly. The chairman closed his eyes after hearing that. Because the company no longer needed reassurance. It needed reality. The following morning, an emergency board session was held before market opening. Daniel Cross attended remotely from Dallas. The atmosphere inside the meeting was colder than anything he had experienced since becoming chief executive officer. Nobody discussed modernization initiatives anymore. Nobody discussed optimization metrics. The conversation centered around institutional survival. One board member summarized the situation bluntly. The company had lost operational credibility faster than expected. That sentence stayed in the room for several seconds afterward. Operational credibility. Not software failure. Not technical disruption. Credibility. Because the market no longer trusted the company to maintain continuity under pressure. And in logistics, trust deterioration spreads faster than infrastructure repair. Daniel Cross tried defending the restructuring. He argued that no organization should depend so heavily on a single individual. Technically, he was correct, but nobody challenged the deeper truth underneath his statement. The company had not depended on one individual accidentally. It depended on him because he had spent 15 years absorbing operational chaos faster than leadership ever invested in replacing it properly. That difference mattered now. The chairman eventually interrupted the discussion and delivered the board decision directly. Andrew Mercer would return temporarily under emergency operational authority, reporting directly to the board. Not to the executive office. Not to consulting leadership. To the board. The silence after that announcement. Andrew Mercer returned to headquarters the following Monday at 5:40 in the morning. Earlier than most employees. Earlier than most executives. The parking structure was almost empty when he walked into the building carrying the same worn leather folder he had used for years. No announcement had been sent company-wide. No internal celebration. The board wanted discretion. The operations teams wanted stability. And Andrew himself wanted silence. A security guard near the lobby nodded at him carefully, as if unsure whether he was actually supposed to be there again. Andrew nodded back and continued toward the operations floor without slowing down. The atmosphere inside the building felt different immediately. People stopped talking when he entered certain rooms. Not out of fear, out of recognition. Several dispatch supervisors looked physically exhausted after nearly a week of manual rerouting procedures and emergency continuity workarounds. One warehouse coordinator had reportedly slept inside the Dallas Operations Center for 3 consecutive nights. Nobody looked embarrassed anymore, only tired. Andrew walked through the operations floor slowly, without speaking, for almost 10 minutes. He studied the routing dashboards, the synchronization reports, the emergency override logs. Then he stopped near the central freight continuity monitor and asked a question quietly enough that only Carla Ruiz heard it clearly. Who approved removing regional fallback sequencing during active migration? Carla did not answer. She simply looked toward the executive floor upstairs. Andrew understood immediately. At 6:14, he requested direct access to the archived continuity architecture. 3 consultants attempted explaining the current recovery strategy before he interrupted them politely. No. Show me what the system is trying to protect itself from. The room fell silent after that sentence. Because none of the consultants had been thinking that way. They treated the infrastructure like software. Andrew treated it like a living operational network under stress. That difference changed the entire recovery approach within the first hour. By 7:02, he identified the first major structural failure. The synchronization engine was not collapsing randomly. It was quarantining unstable freight validation chains automatically because regional override authority had been centralized too aggressively during migration. The system was trying to prevent cascading contamination across routing layers. In other words, parts of the infrastructure were still functioning exactly as Andrew originally designed them to function during instability. Leadership simply no longer understood why. At 8:17, he restored limited regional continuity permissions to 4 dispatch hubs manually. Not fully, carefully, like reopening pressure valves inside an overloaded machine. Within 20 minutes, overnight freight sequencing delays began dropping for the first time in 6 days. Nobody celebrated. Most people on the operations floor looked too exhausted for emotional reactions. But the silence changed. You could feel it. The panic was no longer accelerating. At 10:43, lenders received updated operational stabilization reports directly from the Board Oversight Committee. At noon, one suspended fuel contractor quietly restored emergency authorization flexibility for priority medical freight. By early afternoon, several regional warehouse managers reported that routing confidence had improved enough to reduce manual verification calls. Not solved. Improved. Andrew refused to call the system stable yet, because he understood something executives rarely did. Recovery inside complex logistics networks happened slower than collapse. Every restored layer had to be tested under pressure before it could be trusted again. Meanwhile, the political atmosphere upstairs deteriorated rapidly. Board members bypassed Daniel Cross during multiple operational briefings. Consultants lost direct routing authority completely. Several restructuring initiatives were frozen indefinitely pending infrastructure review. Nobody formally blamed Daniel yet. That made the situation worse. Public removal creates closure. Silent isolation creates fear. Late Tuesday evening, Andrew reviewed archived continuity logs with Carla Ruiz inside the operations center. The building had mostly emptied by then. She studied him for a moment before finally asking the question many employees had quietly wondered since his return. Why did you build so many manual safeguards into the system? Andrew kept reading the reports while answering. Because software behaves logically. People do not. Then he continued turning pages. Weather changes. Fuel shortages happen. Drivers panic. Executives centralize authority during crises. And every time they do, somebody loses visibility somewhere. Carla looked toward the routing floor where exhausted dispatch teams were still manually verifying freight chains under the restored continuity structure. For the first time in nearly a week, the operations center sounded normal again. Phones, printers, quiet conversations. Human rhythm returning slowly to infrastructure that had nearly forgotten how to trust itself. By Friday morning, freight stability metrics improved enough for the board to release a carefully worded public statement about temporary operational disruptions during infrastructure modernization. Nobody inside the company believed the wording mattered anymore, because the real damage had never been technical. It was institutional. The company had spent years believing resilience came from software. Then 1 week of instability revealed the truth. Resilience had been sitting quietly inside a corner office the entire time. 3 months later, the company was operational again. Stable, profitable, quiet, but it no longer looked the same. The restructuring program that once dominated executive presentations had been dismantled almost completely. Consulting contracts were terminated. Regional continuity authority had been permanently restored. The board created an entirely new operational oversight committee after lenders demanded direct resilience auditing across all logistics infrastructure. Nobody inside the company used the phrase personality-dependent systems anymore. That language disappeared after the crisis, along with several careers. Daniel Cross officially resigned 9 weeks after Andrew Mercer returned. The public statement described the decision as a leadership transition during infrastructure stabilization efforts. Inside the company, nobody discussed it much. Most employees had already emotionally moved on long before the announcement became official. That was the strange thing about operational organizations. People adapt quickly once survival returns. The real memory remains inside the systems. Inside routing behaviors. Inside emergency procedures. Inside the quiet habits workers develop after watching an institution fail under pressure. Andrew never accepted a permanent executive role afterward. The board offered one twice. Higher compensation, expanded authority, long-term retention incentives. He declined all of it. Not dramatically, not emotionally. He simply explained that operational continuity should never depend on one person again. The irony inside that statement stayed with the board for a very long time. Because Andrew was the first person in the building who truly understood how dangerous that dependency had become, even while he was carrying it himself. Instead, he remained temporarily as an independent infrastructure advisor while regional systems were rebuilt properly. This time, continuity architecture was documented. Emergency authority was decentralized carefully. Weather protocols were stress-tested repeatedly. Dispatch supervisors regained practical decision authority during unstable conditions. For the first time in years, the company stopped treating logistics like pure software and started treating it like human infrastructure again. Several months later, a competing national freight network hired Andrew to help redesign emergency continuity systems across its Midwest operations division. The announcement never became major news. But inside the logistics industry, people noticed immediately. Because competitors had watched the collapse carefully. Not the public collapse, the quieter one underneath it. The moment an entire corporation realized it no longer understood the systems keeping it alive. One evening near the end of winter, Carla Ruiz called Andrew from the Dallas Operations Center after a severe weather disruption forced emergency rerouting across 4 states. Nothing catastrophic, just heavy ice movement through Missouri and Kansas. The kind of night that usually created freight instability. She explained that the new continuity structure had stabilized successfully under pressure for the first time. No routing drift. No synchronization failure. No lender escalation. No emergency override confusion. Just controlled adaptation. Andrew listened quietly, then asked the same question he always asked during disruptions. How are the drivers holding up? Carla smiled slightly before answering. Tired, but stable. After the call ended, Andrew remained sitting alone in his office for several minutes, watching freight movement reports update across the regional map. The system looked cleaner now, safer, less dependent on invisible judgment buried inside undocumented layers. That was good. It was what should have happened years earlier. Outside the office windows, snow moved slowly across the parking lot lights, while interstate freight continued flowing west through the night. Steady again. Predictable again. For years, executives believed the company survived because of software. Then one week of operational panic exposed something far more uncomfortable. The infrastructure had never depended on automation alone. It depended on experience, memory, judgment under pressure, the quiet decisions nobody notices while everything works. That was the part the artificial intelligence models never understood. The system could calculate distance. It could predict fuel consumption. It could optimize freight timing. But it could not recognize hesitation in a dispatch supervisor's voice during an approaching storm. It could not understand when exhausted drivers stopped trusting route stability. And it could not feel the moment institutional confidence begins collapsing long before the dashboards turn red. Andrew Mercer understood those things. Not because he was smarter than the system. Because he spent 15 years listening to the parts of the system executives never heard. In the end, the company recovered. The freight moved again. The lenders stayed. The warehouses stabilized. But somewhere inside board meeting records and archived operational reviews, one lesson remained permanently embedded into the company afterward. The most dangerous infrastructure failures rarely begin with broken software. They begin the moment leadership mistakes invisible competence for replaceable overhead.